I can remain dependent on the system and hope that politician XYZ will magically save the day and fix the country and, ends this ruling power of 80 plus years of, intelligence and organized crime. Yeah, I think it's really something that has to be sort of done on an individual level, and people need to take individual responsibility if they don't want to be part of this system, particularly as we move into this increasingly digital future that these very small handful of companies are going to completely control.
In this recent interview on the Kim Iversen show with Whitney Webb, we learn about an elite blackmail ring, big tech's hidden power in politics, and why mainstream platforms avoid her message. These explosive revelations come from Whitney. Webb, a journalist who's earned the elite's fear by exposing their secrets, she connects the dots between shady intelligence operations and the tech billionaires shaping our future, offering insight that mainstream media won't. Dare it touch this conversation, challenges everything we think we know about who really runs the show and what that means for savvy investors. Before we begin this discussion, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel. Now let's hear more from Whitney Webb.
Israel's openly, at this point an ethno state. So it's only for that specific demographic that benefits from those types of immigration policies there. Sure. Well, I think even more than that too, I think it's been pretty clear with this administration and in last year's election that podcasts were really seen as a more important outlet for reaching the public than mainstream media, which I think is also pretty significant. So a lot of the biggest podcasts have definitely been arguably more influenced than others by that regard. And, a lot of these bigger podcasts, Rogan included, having Trump on, having J.D. Vance on. And I've been, of course, very critical of J.D. Vance's longtime benefactor, I guess you could say, Peter Thiel, who's also been on the Rogan podcast. I don't, I think he, some people there would prefer I didn't really maybe discuss some of those ties because they do come up in my Epstein-related work. And some people, I guess in the case of, Ian perhaps has been pretty supportive of Musk and some of these figures in government, but also, does cite a lot of research for my book. So perhaps that was, reasoning, but it's speculative. Again, I don't really know. And I'm happy for him that he had a chance to do, a big interview on, the biggest podcast in the world, I guess. But as you noted, I did have some criticisms, but as it related specifically to my book and my work, because I felt like some of the things that were conveyed weren't necessarily 100% accurate. And so because that's seen by so many people and I'm not really doing that many interviews right now, and I'm not as active maybe as I used to be on social media and things like that, obviously people are going to develop conceptions and opinions about my work that are being given by someone other than me. And so I felt it was necessary to kind of, clarify a few. Well, that was one of the two, I guess, main things that I wanted to clarify. So essentially my book does argue for a significant tie of between Epstein and the state of Israel. But really the claims that are detailed in my book argue for a tie between Epstein and really Israeli military intelligence, more specifically as it relates to like a formal Israeli intelligence agency. And Mossad isn't necessarily part of Israeli military intelligence, but is obviously part of the broader Israeli national security apparatus. And so there's a military directorate that controls all of the Israeli military intelligence agencies that's called Amman. And that was basically run by Ehud Barak, a close Epstein associate in the mid-1980s at the time that Epstein was alleged to have been recruited into that network via, Robert Maxwell. Some of the claims for this come from former Israeli military intelligence operatives like Ari Ben Menashe, but also some other sources that have remained anonymous but are deemed to be credible, and some other things, that happened over the years. And obviously there was some sort of tie there, as Epstein was awaiting, for example, his sweetheart deal sentencing, in the 2007-ish period. He was in Israel, presumably considering not returning to the U.S. to face, whatever sentence he was going to be doled out. It was during the sentencing period, I believe. But according to, local reports and, Palm Beach newspapers, he was touring Israeli military bases, which is kind of unusual if you're just a reclusive billionaire. I mean, yeah, I do. But I, there's a figure that I've sort of been writing about who's not necessarily a pedophile, but he's accused of rape. The film director, Brett Ratner, who has some interesting ties to sort of the network behind Epstein and also to the Diddy cases. And a lot of organized crime ties that don't really seem to have been previously reported as it relates to Ratner. And Ratner was basically granted an Israeli passport a week after being Netanyahu's special guest at the UN alongside Alan Dershowitz. And he had previously, Ratner, done a major joint venture with this Australian billionaire named James Packer, who is one of the main figures in the Netanyahu corruption trial that's still ongoing for bribery and things like that. So there's a lot of strange things that sometimes happen in these power networks, and sometimes, and I'm aware of other cases as well that involve pedophiles specifically, where allegedly, they're granted the right to immigrate. And it's, all the circumstantial available evidence points to them evading charges in other countries and what have you. But that,
The numbers tell the story. Institutional demand is surging while available Bitcoin supply tightens post-halving. Yet, prices remain unexpectedly steady. Market makers may be holding back volatility, but the fundamentals are clear. ETFs, nation-states, and as we just heard Whitney Webb discuss the elite blackmail ring, now let's hear her elaborate on big tech's hidden power in politics and why mainstream platforms avoid her message. Whitney isn't afraid to name names, as she reveals how Silicon Valley titans entwine themselves with political power behind closed doors. She also confronts head-on why her groundbreaking work gets so little attention from the mainstream, exposing the silent treatment that truth-tellers often face. Now let's listen to what Whitney Webb has to say.
Well, I think these days a lot of influencers are being paid, and there are, scandals that have sort of, mini scandals, I guess, that have sort of come out to that effect. But, as it relates to, just the Epstein scandal alone, depending on what side of the political divide you fall on and how easily manipulated you are, like what influencers or podcasters or whatever that you follow, there's efforts to link Epstein to certain names specifically. So in the right, a lot of people tend to look at Epstein as, Epstein and Bill Clinton, Epstein and Kevin Spacey, Epstein, and just specific names. And then, of course, on the left will be a more focus on Epstein and Donald Trump and figures that are more, hated by that particular political demographic right now. And there's consistently been an effort to sort of focus on the salacious material of Epstein, the celebrity aspect, his ties to famous people, or his ties to politicians of one particular divide, so that depending on who you're listening to can create an echo chamber, and people, on the right in particular, may not necessarily connect Epstein's activities to, I mean, it's a global thing, and it's been going on for a very long time. But I do want to go back to why I chose to clarify this in particular on Twitter, because as we've just talked about, I do absolutely think there was an Israeli state connection in some capacity, even if not Epstein being directly affiliated with, Mossad as an agency. But I do, basically what the thesis of my book is something much broader than that. I basically argue that Epstein was part of this transnational network that's also really transgenerational, that was created through basically this fusion of organized crime interests and intelligence agencies going back to the 1940s. And this, of course, would predate the existence of the state of Israel, which wasn't created until 1948. And these networks had already essentially come together by that point in time. And, I essentially argue that there's a significant amount of CIA ties, US intelligence ties as well in this network, and that, they're transnational in scope. And a lot of the organized crime network that's affiliated with this spans, has a lot of interests in both the U.S. and Israel, but also, has expanded through partnerships, for example, between people like Robert Maxwell and Simeon Mogilevich to Eastern Europe, Russia, and beyond. And I think a lot of the stuff, for example, that sort of percolated up what was true about the stuff people were trying to go after Trump for in Russiagate was really more related to this specific organized crime network, but you can't go deep enough to prosecute anything without coming up with ties to powerful people in Israel and also the U.S. And it's ultimately, affects, at least as it relates to the U.S., both parties very significantly. Yeah. And I talked a lot about in my book about this particular network of oligarchs based in the U.S. That have been referred to by the Wall Street Journal as either the study group and the mega group, and how they seem to have a lot of influence over what Epstein was doing, and also, the governments of both countries, and pretty much most of the known members or earliest members of that group, including, Leslie Wexner and Charles and Edgar Bronfman, have historic, if not continuing ties to organized crime. So I basically make a much bigger case than saying Epstein was Mossad, for example. I think just saying reductive, because in trying to, if you really are interested in sort of informing people and with the intent of undoing this power structure's control over society, you have to understand that it's much bigger than any one nation state. And I think also, just like people trying to say Epstein was CIA, or for example, without mentioning Israel, it can be kind of myopic. You're absolving one of the other intelligence factions that was absolutely involved, and sort of taking people away from the fact that the power of these networks is transnational. It's not exclusive to a single nation state. And I think, those are ultimately important points. And what the evidence shows about Epstein is that he's tied to this particular network that knits together organized crime like oligarchs with intelligence agencies, and the influence that those networks have had, not just on Epstein's own network, but how Epstein, is basically middle management or a force for that broader network, and how he's making ties, for example, with every single major big tech CEO of importance. Obviously, Bill Gates got a lot of the focus, but, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, all of these people had some connection with Epstein, which kind of brings me to my other criticism in the aforementioned tweet about, claims that were made about my work. So Ian in that interview described some of my work on big tech CEOs, namely Peter Thiel. He used the word unhinged. He later said that he didn't mean to use that word and should have used a different word. But in the context of saying that, also said that my historical facing work, like on Epstein's history, was valuable. But basically, and more or less implied that my work on current figures is not. But actually, my work on Peter Thiel is intimately connected to my work on Epstein. And in my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, I basically conclude with the point that someone like Epstein is no longer really relevant for intelligence services or organized crime networks or oligarch networks in the age of technology. And why is that? So back in the day, you have Epstein and a litany of other figures like him, which I detail figures in my book. He was obviously not an anomaly at all. But that type of sexual blackmail operation comes with a lot of risk. It takes a lot of money to finance, the person who's running it, their mansion, their parties, paying off women, all of these money flows. It can be risky. And it certainly ended up being that in the Epstein case, right? Because he was he was discovered, arrested twice, and it obviously took a lot of money to cover things up, at least the first time, and arguably the second time as well, where he ended up dead. So what's a better alternative? Well, if you have everyone onboarded onto digital systems that you control, like the CIA being at the origins of Google, DARPA being at the origins of Facebook, the CIA being at the origins of Oracle, and a lot of these other entities, Bill Gates and Microsoft having ties to the Maxwell family as early as the late 90s and things like that. And obviously Gates and Epstein, what does that ultimately mean? Like, I think, at this point in time, we've learned through either whistleblowers or other means that intelligence agencies access or can access pretty much any part of our digital footprint, no matter how secure we tend to think it is. And that's like with revelations about, ostensibly secure messaging apps like Signal being compromised.
To watch the full interview, check out the link in the description. This interview covered it all, from the unthinkable reach of an elite blackmail scheme to the behind-the-scenes influence of tech giants on our government, and even the blatant suppression of independent voices like Whitney. These are critical truths that no savvy investor can afford to ignore. Do you think these hidden alliances between elitists and tech giants are impacting our economy and investments? How can decentralized technologies help level the playing field against such concentrated power? Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe, like, and share our video for more engaging content exploring the innovative world of decentralized technologies.